So when I was growing up, my grandmother told me to avoid cold showers if I was having my period. I was also not supposed to leave the house with my hair wet, unless it was summer. When we traveled to the mountains, my other grandmother would fill her lungs with forest air. She claimed to feel instantly healthier. I'm sure we all heard similar things, even if the origin of this advice is often forgotten. But much of it comes from thousands of years ago, from Greco-Roman medicine. Let's talk about preventive medicine, and especially the 6 non-natural things, or the non-naturals. This is a key concept if you're interested in the history of medicine, and it's one which I end up using a lot in many videos. So I thought it might be helpful to go through them all, and just how crucial this idea was to how people thought about the human body, and how to keep it healthy. Hopefully, a lot of weird-sounding advice will make much more sense by the end of this video. Hello, lovely history fans. I'm Dr. Julia Martins, and I'm a historian of medicine and gender. And this is Pancake. So I'm interested in how people thought about the body in the past and how that shapes the present. If you're new here, welcome to my channel where I talk about the history of everyday life. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you know when a new video is out. I also do have a Patreon if you would like to support my work and help me keep on making history videos. So, what do combing your hair, going for a walk, and avoid napping lying down all tell us about this intriguing concept of the non-naturals? What were they, and why were they so central to how people thought about their health? Let's get into it. Let's go back to Greco-Roman medicine. In antiquity, health was understood through a holistic framework. The body itself was made of natural things, so the elements, humors, faculties, and spirits. But the body was also subject to the non-natural things, things which affected bodily health. If balance was lacking, things against nature, so illnesses, could threaten the body. So, the non-naturals weren't unnatural things, but rather specific things external to the body. These things had a big influence on the body's humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And it was their balance which determined someone's health. So if you didn't pay attention to these non-natural things, the body's natural, healthy state could turn to the contra-natural state of illness, in no small part because of humoral imbalance. By regulating the non-naturals, on the other hand, you could protect the body in advance. For instance, you could prevent seasonal illnesses by adapting your diet. I'll explain each of these non-naturals in a minute, but let me just give you some context. So, in the Hippocratic tradition, this kind of preventive medicine relied heavily on the balance between exercise and nourishment. By Galen's time, the number of factors you should consider in order to remain healthy had expanded, and Galen's followers coined the expression non-natural things to describe them. During the medieval period, these texts were translated and expanded on by Arabic physicians, especially Ibn Sina. In his work, the Canon of Medicine, which was the most popular medical textbook well into the Renaissance, he maintained the classical idea that prevention and treatment were equally important in medicine. Treatment and prevention were actually two sides of the same coin. Medicine was not only a healing art, but the art of preserving health. So, the fields of hygiene and dietetics, roughly what we would today call preventive medicine, were further developed during this period by physicians such as Aldobrandino da Siena and Arnau de Villanova, relying heavily on this classical tradition. So, by the Renaissance, prevention was a key branch of medicine, and doctors' advice centered around managing the non-naturals. Physicians who routinely prescribed remedies for their patients rather than creating a bespoke regimen for them were criticized by their peers. George Shane, whose writing style is just irresistible to read, it's just so fun. He described these less than competent practitioners as people who never dare order a regimen and who are continually cramming their patients with nauseous and loathsome potions, pills, and boluses, electuaries, powders, and juleps. For Shane, prevention was key. Plus, although doctors had been writing regimens of health for centuries, so guides on healthy living essentially, these books were now available in print, making them available to many more readers than ever before. People worried about getting a good night's sleep, which kind of exercise best suited their bodies, how to keep their hair clean, and whether the air around them was beneficial to their health. And not just wealthy people, although of course if you had more money and more resources, more time, that all determined how much agency and choice you could have over your health. For instance, you could decide on the ideal place to build a house. But even tradesmen and craftsmen could have access to this kind of advice. Remember that this was a time in which much was still unknown about how the body and disease actually worked, so seeking advice about managing the non-naturals would have given lay people this sort of sense of control over their lives. This led to a widespread culture of prevention during the Renaissance, and the non-naturals, as a flexible framework for thinking about health in the body, acted as a bedrock upon which preventive medicine was then developed. So, if we think of a 16th century person interested in buying a book about domestic medicine at their local fair, they usually could choose between two big groups of books. Recipe books, which were full of remedies for common ailments and regimens for a healthy life. The first group was usually about treating a specific problem, while the latter was about preventing illness in the first place. So as I mentioned, a regimen was a collection of guidelines on how to remain healthy, essentially. They were addressed to a general readership, and they were full of advice about the non-naturals. In fact, these books remained popular for centuries, and they were still structured around the non-naturals well into the 18th century. So, how would, say, a 16th century person go about preventing illness? Well, they needed to be mindful of these 6 non-natural things which determined health. So, food and drink, exercise and rest, air, sleep, evacuation and repletion, and strong emotions. There were no universal rules though. Everything had to be adapted to the person's individual bodily constitution. And doctors didn't always agree. I mean, one of them, Ippolito Guarinoni, even suggested that there should be a 7th non-natural, God. But let's stick with the 6 less controversial ones for today. I won't go into too much detail here, but let me know in the comments if you have any questions or whether you would like me to tell you more about any of these topics. Today, whether you're browsing books at the library or watching a TikTok, most dietary advice has to do with weight management, or maybe preventing heart disease or dealing with diabetes. Renaissance physicians, on the other hand, wrote of how rational thought could be improved through diet, how fevers could be avoided, how infertility could be treated, and how humoral balance could be achieved and maintained. In the same way that people had individual constitutions, so too did foods and beverages, which could be hot, cold, dry, or wet. These qualities should be taken into consideration when choosing and preparing food and drink. For instance, wine was believed to heat the body, which is why it should be drunk in moderation, especially by those who had a choleric or a sanguine temperament. Those who were pregnant or nursing should water their wine, water it down to diminish its heat, for instance. It was believed that the stomach was responsible for concocting food before it would be distributed in the body by the blood. Because they influence the digestive process, some foods such as raw vegetables were believed to prepare the stomach for a meal, while others would be more suited to closing the stomach afterwards. That's why people would eat cheese at the end of a meal, and many still do. And if you would like to explore this in more detail, I suggest checking out another video that I made on this subject, on the subject of food and the order in which people ate at the time. You may have heard of the miasma theory before, the idea that disease was caused by a miasma, so bad or corrupted air. Many conditions from the plague to cholera have been explained through this framework. This was a highly influential idea from antiquity until well into the 19th century and the development of germ theory. But even if you're not specifically thinking of disease, the nature of the air was considered important to maintaining health too. The air was a common cause of concern for 16th century people. Was it cold or hot, humid or dry? See how we come back to these qualities and their relationships with the humoral theory. Depending on the person's constitution, age, gender, and the season of the year, the air could have different effects. For Ibn Sina, the air should be temperate, light, bright, moving gently, and smelling sweet. People were advised to purify the air with fire and scented herbs. And just a quick tangent here. So the plague doctor and that famous mask that they wore, they are a great example of that. By breathing through the mask, whose long beak was filled with special herbs, physicians were believed to be protected from the corrupt air around those who were ill. Plus, doctors often prescribed a change of location to their patients in the hope that illness could be cured in a place where the air was different. This was particularly common in the 19th century. The brain was thought to be very vulnerable to air. I mean, have you ever noticed when you visit a museum, how people in the past always seem to be wearing headwear or hats in the paintings? I mean, besides fashion itself, the concern with air was crucial. It directly influenced fashion, not to mention architecture. An ideal Italian villa in the Renaissance would have been high up to enjoy the breeze and the sun, but also not too exposed to inclement winds. And don't even think about building your dream house next to a sewer, but I mean, who would if given the choice, right? So many of these ideas still survive today. In Italy, people talk about a colpo d'aria, literally a hit of air, as something that can cause coughs, muscular pain, and all kinds of things. I recently made a video on Girolamo Mercuriale, a Renaissance physician who was a big advocate for exercise, so go check that out if you'd like to learn more. But to sum it up, exercise was believed to improve bodily functions. For instance, it heated the body, promoting digestion. It opened the pores, allowing waste to leave the body through sweat. For Galen, exercise should be vigorous, accompanied by accelerating breathing. But later physicians, like Mercuriale, cautioned people to be moderate and to adapt exercise to their individual needs. They could be active, such as walking, or passive, such as being transported in a carriage. Those who could not partake in strenuous activities could resort to baths or massages, which would attain similar health results. And it does sound much nicer, to be fair. In any case, exercise should be followed by rest, which was equally important for the body to recover. Regimens of health directed people about how, for how long, and when one should sleep to maximize their health. The main concern was with digestion, as it was believed that sleep was caused by the vapors rising from the food in the stomach to the brain as it was digested. Daytime naps were then not advised, as they wouldn't be long enough for digestion to be complete. Plus, they could cause laziness. As wealthier parts of the population did start to nap in the 17th century, it was thought that a wooden chair would be ideal. Can you imagine that? Because it was not too comfortable, and that was the goal. So sleeping on your back was not advised usually, as these vapors could get blocked in the brain. So better to sit up, I guess. Elevating your head and sleeping on one side would be better for digestion as well as protecting the brain. Ideally, you should switch sides every couple of hours. But I'm not sure how often people follow this advice after a rich mutton stew and wine. But in any case, though, you should be mindful of how you slept, and advice would change according to the seasons and your age, and whether you were pregnant. As always, though, by the time you're 8 or 9 months pregnant, you should be glad, I think, if you can manage to sleep at all, really. But anyway, that was plenty of advice. Stay with me, this is not as disgusting as it may seem. We're not only talking about urine and feces here. There are many other kinds of excrements in the way that people thought about the body in this period. So within the humoral understanding of the body, corrupt or excessive humors often needed to be purged and impurities expelled. The regular purging of the body was seen as essential to maintaining your health. So bloodletting, inducing vomit, provoking sweat, as well as stimulating retained menstruation were all important parts of preventing illness, and not just treatments for it. Even a person's sex life would fall under this category, as fluids were evacuated, expelled from the body. And that was important, as excessive superfluous fluids might cause blockages if not removed from the body. My grandmother, the paternal one this time, she believed we should brush our hair vigorously, especially before bed. That would make sense to our hypothetical 16th century person buying a book at the local fair, even though they were more likely to comb their hair in the morning. Combs were essential in removing the excrements of the head, and combing one's hair was not just about vanity, but about preventing brain issues by making sure that what needed to be expelled from the body didn't cause any obstructions. If you're interested in bodily hygiene, I suggest checking out my other video on that for more details. But just think of barbers and their connection to medicine, especially barber surgeons. They took care of people's hair, beards, nails, ears, teeth, and skin, mainly for hygienic purposes. They even had separate comb sets for beards and hair. You wouldn't want any cross-contamination with your head's excrements, right? To round up our set of non-naturals and thinking of lifestyle and well-being, to use contemporary terms, we need to talk about the passions, which the Greeks called the accidents of the soul. So what we might today think of as mental health. A person's emotional life was thought to greatly affect their health. This was mainly because these fluctuations influenced the heart, responsible for heating the body through the blood. Emotions would have a direct effect on the body's temperature, therefore, and, as we have seen, the balance between hot-cold and wet-dry was central in the humoral understanding of the body. So, physicians advise their patients to be careful with the passions most likely to disturb their humoral balance. Someone of a choleric temperament should be careful with anger or hate, as they would make the body drier and hotter. On the other hand, another patient might benefit from periodic outbursts of anger if they needed to release excessive heat. Doctors advise their patients on managing their emotional states. This psychosomatic approach to health was, of course, very different to how we conceptualize the relationship between the body and the mind today, but there's no arguing that there is a connection between mental and bodily health. So, emotions, especially strong emotions, were a crucial part of the non-naturals. As it's often the case for Renaissance writers, the key was moderation, as a sudden emotional change could trigger illness or even death. I mean, remember all the stories of people dying from a broken heart in literature? The non-naturals are very much behind that idea. The non-naturals are a big topic in the same way that the humoral theory is, and much more could be said about each of them. For centuries, environment and lifestyle were crucial to how physicians and patients thought about health. I mean, phlebotomy or bloodletting was still practiced until well into the 19th century, in many cases as a preventive measure, rather than a treatment. Of course, all that changed with the bacteriological revolution of the late 19th century. But in any case, understandings of how the non-naturals should be managed vary greatly across time and space, and this video can only hope to give you the briefest introduction to this subject. But I do hope that I managed to show the logic behind this way of thinking about health and what we would today call lifestyle and how it affects the body. My grandmothers might have been a bit off with their advice, but they were the heirs to a long tradition of trying to be as healthy as possible and to live a long life. And isn't that what we all want? By the way, let me know in the comments if you've ever heard this kind of advice in your own family or community. I'd be curious to know. But in any case, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more history content. And if you are feeling particularly generous, do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. It really does make a big difference. Thank you and see you next time.